Welcome to lesson 2. Let's talk about appetite regulation. So here is a nice graphic by MacLean and colleagues describing the interrelationship of the central nervous system, GI tract, and changes in body mass, changes in energy balance, and how this is affected by exercise, and how it affects the various hormones and physiological systems in the body that are integrated to regulate appetite. So the gut provides feedback through neural and endocrine pathways that involve dynamic, or sometimes called episodic, hunger and satiety signals. And hunger is hunger as you know it. Satiety means the lessening of hunger. It's just the opposite of hunger. It's a controlled appetite when you think of satiety. Um, there's a subtle difference between satiety and satiation. Satiety is the effect of the diet overall. Satiation is the specific point where you have controlled hunger or when hunger has stopped. But yeah, so the gut provides certain signals that can determine different states of hunger and satiety, and this can depend on a number of things, not the least of which is the so-called prandial state. Now, when you hear the term postprandial, it means post-meal. So when I talk about prandial state, we're talking about either the fed versus the fasted state. That is what the prandial state is. Exercise can influence appetite through its impact on these biological inputs, but the overall impact is variable. And it's complicated by a number of things. There can be super compensatory effects. There can be different effects that ultimately affect eating behavior, and individuals show a relatively wide variation of response to exercise and how it affects hunger. However, we're going to look at some research that show what the weight of the evidence indicates regarding how exercise affects appetite. And so it's really cool, and it's happens to be hopeful. So stay tuned for that. All right, so the big thing about the physiological control of appetite and these different elements in the axis of appetite regulation, not everybody is the same. Some people have very strong hunger responses. Some people have very strong satiety tendencies. Some people have what's called very high satiety sensitivity, which is a good thing. It means that your fullness and hunger cues are working quite well. What typically happens in obesity is very high levels of hunger combined with very strong psychological as well as physiological drives to eat, and habits that enable passive overeating and environments that enable passive overeating. And this would be combined with a very low satiety response. And so that is a recipe for excessive weight gain. All right. And it starts early. These biological inputs, these responses, and the way that the body generates satiety and hunger signals, it is established early in infancy, in fact. And the way that you're raised from birth, in terms of what you're exposed to your parents or your guardians, eating habits, and how they actually structured your meal schedule in terms of how they responded to your cues and demands in combination with what they actually fed you, well, that actually can form your neural circuits over time and create certain predispositions in both a good direction and an unfavorable direction. So this stuff starts early. All right, so let's talk about exercise and appetite regulation. Subjects with overweight and obesity were examined within 42 studies in this particular systematic review and meta-analysis. This was a relatively recent one by Beaulieu and colleagues. So it was a relatively large systematic review and meta-analysis with 42 studies, median study duration of 12 weeks. And contrary to the popular belief and the popular claim that exercise is a treacherous thing because it just increases appetite, this was something that was propagated a lot through the 2000s and the early 2010s, with certain books kind of downplaying the importance and the effect of exercise. It made the general public feel like exercise was just kind of useless because it'll just make you hungry. That was the claim. But this systematic review and meta-analysis found that the imposition of an exercise training regime, in other words, when you put people on a training regime, and this systematic review looked specifically at people with overweight and obesity, they found that when you put them on an exercise regime, this does not induce any meaningful change in food intake or appetite during the trial, during the period of exercise training. So, furthermore, they found other positive effects of exercise. So, exercise can beneficially affect eating behavior by exerting what they called spillover effects. So, these spillover effects of exercise positively influence food choices and food intake. In other words, it's almost like when you take the time and the effort to exercise and you make that sacrifice, you have a tendency to not want to make that time and effort go in vain. And so that has a spillover effect into other positive habits, including eating habits, when people engage in an exercise routine. And furthermore, these authors also found that they did a separate analysis of eating behavior traits, and they found a decrease in dietary disinhibition. So disinhibition is the phenomenon where you just say, forget it, screw it, to hell with it. That's disinhibition. You're lifting off the inhibitions to proceeding with an unfavorable behavior, let's say. So they found a decrease in dietary disinhibition and uncontrolled eating after exercise, as well as an increase in dietary restraint. So these are all good things as a result of exercise on subjects with overweight and obesity. And here we have a narrative review, an even more recent one by Caruso and colleagues, where they found that current evidence suggests that physically active individuals have improved appetite sensitivity. Like I mentioned previously, appetite sensitivity is the accurate sensing of hunger and satiety cues. And this could benefit long-term energy regulation. And therefore, they concluded that exercise should be promoted as a universal method of inducing an acute energy deficit, and engaging in regular physical activity may promote a closer link between energy intake and energy expenditure in the long term, which, put more simply, exercise is definitely a strong beneficial programming element. It's not something that is automatically going to raise your appetite or hunger levels if it's implemented. In fact, it either doesn't do that at all, or it adds to your ability to control overeating, and there are positive spillover effects on other aspects of diet, like food choices. So now let's talk about the psychological influences on the self-regulatory control of appetite. So this is a little bit of an esoteric avenue, but bear with me, we'll get through it. Okay, so the chronic failure to consistently self-regulate eating behavior and energy balance is a leading cause of population-wide obesity. So appetite in large part, in the context of obesity, how it affects obesity is really, do you have a strong self-regulatory mechanism in place? Or is it somewhat weak, poor, or is it defective? And so if you do not have strong self-regulatory control of your appetite, then you open up the possibility of steady weight gain all the way to excess weight gain over time. And this phenomenon of body fat accumulation is exacerbated by the modern obesogenic environment. And so when we say the obesogenic environment, I'm talking about personal slash immediate environment, like at the home, for example, at the workplace, and also the so-called built environment can also be obesogenic. Like it can prevent regular physical activity if there's really no options to either walk around or run around or bike around. And the given resources that are in place or that are established in a given geographical location, that can be part of the environment that also can be obesogenic. And so self-regulatory capacity can be compromised by these external factors. And the obesogenic environment is definitely something that needs to be considered when we're talking about things that can make it difficult to achieve self-regulatory control of appetite. Another set of factors are social factors. And these things can influence our ability to self-regulate appetite control. Social factors include things like family rituals, our peer group rituals, what we do with our friends. There can be purposeful peer pressure going on or unintended peer pressure from groups or individuals. And all of these things influence self-regulatory control of appetite. And so another factor that can greatly influence appetite is negative affect. In other words, negative mood or negative emotion. So this is a common cause of self-regulation failure, not just for dieting or eating right, but across a wide range of behavioral domains. So it's not surprising that there's a strong and pretty consistent association between depression and obesity. Executive functioning, in psychological parlance, it means it's a set of three core executive functions, which are self-control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So poor executive functioning can be both a result of as well as a contributor to obesity. And another thing that can influence the self-regulatory control of appetite is how effectively goal setting is done. And so there are two particular types of goals that are productive for positively influencing the self-regulation of dietary habits and appetite in general. So these two type of goals are approach goals and mastery goals. So approach goals would be including certain foods in the diet or seeking to add things to the diet. And the opposite of that would be avoidance goals or subtraction goals, like taking things out of the diet or avoiding certain things. And then another effective goal is a mastery oriented goal. And as opposed to a performance goal. So all of these types of goals are viable, but in particular, approach goals and mastery goals. So approach goals versus avoidance goals, and mastery goals versus performance goals. So let me explain. Mastery goals would be to build a certain type of skill, like cooking, for example, as opposed to performance goals where, you have to weigh a certain amount by a certain date type of thing. And while that can be indicated or appropriate for certain individuals, it's not universally beneficial. Okay, so if somebody has a mastery goal, then this has an important effect on how people view setbacks. So if a mastery goal is in place, if a skill building or learning goal is in place, then setbacks are not evaluated immediately as failures as they would be in performance oriented goal setting. So with a mastery oriented goal setting model, then setbacks would be looked at as learning experience from which to take into account and then do better as you move forward. So there are other things like, aside from goal setting, there's goal striving, and there's a whole art and science to that. And goal striving would the objective would be to complement the goal setting, and that would involve planning, altering the environment, changing the routine, and facilitate the building of habits. And so there's an interesting piece, bit of food for thought about having willpower versus building habits. So we all have a finite amount of willpower. So given that willpower is something that's in limited supply, the solution to our limited amount of willpower would be to build habits that foster behaviors and countermeasures that occur automatically without relying on conscious effort. So habit building is kind of the antidote to relying on willpower. And with that, we're done with lesson 2. I will see you back for lesson 3, where we talk about fat balance and fat cell dynamics.